A whisper in the dark, not from a ghost, but from something far more unsettling. A voice no one expected, speaking through porcelain lips. In a world where fear takes the shape of toys and silence is used as a weapon, one quiet drawing might be the key to everything. This is a case of shadows, memory, and the fragile truth only a child dared to hold. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on one of those dismal October afternoons. Rain against the panes like a persistent petitioner, and the grey of London pressing itself against our windows, that I found Sherlock Holmes seated in a posture that bespoke both irritation and despair. His long fingers drummed listlessly upon the arm of his chair, while the blue smoke of his pipe hung above him like a cloud of thwarted deduction. The Times lay crumpled on the floor, untouched save for the agony column, and even his violin, usually a companion in such lulls, rested neglected upon the mantel. Baker Street itself seemed to hold its breath. "There is something intolerably offensive about peace," Holmes muttered at last, rising to pace with his usual feline grace. "It dulls the mind like fog dulls the skyline." He halted by the window, squinting out at the blurred world beyond. No scandals, no disappearances, not even a forged signature to sharpen the brain. The criminal class is hibernating, Watson. He lit a Greek cigarette with a snap. Even the telegraph wires appear to have fallen into a sulk. We are surrounded by mediocrity, my dear fellow. Damp, respectable mediocrity. Just then, a knock, gentle but urgent, sounded upon the sitting-room door, followed by the familiar tones of Mrs. Hudson. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes." Unannounced. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Curious, show her in." A moment later, a figure entered whom I might have described as elderly, were it not for the elegance of her carriage. She was garbed in black lace with gloves frayed at the edges, and in her gloved hands she carried a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her expression was pinched with some private horror, though she carried herself with the rigid dignity peculiar to governesses and widows. Without invitation, she stepped forward and, unwrapping the bundle, revealed a porcelain doll of the finest workmanship, its face painted in delicate pinks, its eyes open wide as if in perpetual surprise. "This," she said in a voice that trembled despite its training, "is why I've come." She placed the doll carefully upon our side table. Holmes observed it with a glance that flickered from curiosity to disinterest. "It speaks," the woman whispered. "But only when no one is watching." Holmes said nothing, but the pipe lowered slightly in his hand. "It says things," she went on, eyes darting. "Things no doll should know." "I beg your pardon," I said, leaning forward. The woman looked directly at Holmes. "A child I look after, a girl of 7, swears the doll spoke in her mother's voice. And last night, I heard it too. It whispered, 'Don't tell about the man with the red hands.'" There was silence in the room. The rain continued its soft drumming. Holmes' expression had altered, the subtle sharpening of the eyes, the tilt of the head, the barely perceptible shift, from languor to alertness. "A doll that speaks when unobserved," he murmured, "and speaks of guilt. Fascinating." He rose slowly and approached both the woman and the doll. "You've not come from any asylum, I presume?" he said mildly. "No, sir," she replied, flushed but firm. "Then please have a seat. You and your disturbingly eloquent companion." He turned to me, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Watson, I believe we found our afternoon." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Now, madam, if you would be so good as to begin at the beginning. But first, your name?" "Miss Ellen Vervain." "And this doll, Miss Vervain. Where exactly did she learn to whisper murder?" "My name is Miss Ellen Vervain," she began, her voice clipped with the habitual precision of a governess long accustomed to being neither heard nor heeded. "Until recently, I was employed at Vernham Hall in Wiltshire. in the household of Sir Reginald Vernham. I came to London on short leave, but now I do not believe I shall return." She paused, as if startled by her own words. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingertips pressed together. "You left without notice?" "Not entirely. I claimed illness." Her tone grew more guarded. "I have looked after the little girl, Lydia, since early spring. Her mother, Lady Vernham, took to her bed in July and has not been seen since. Sir Reginald insists she is resting abroad. The servants murmur but will not say. And the child—" She stopped. "The child believes her mother still speaks to her, through that." Her eyes flicked to the doll. Holmes gestured for her to continue, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The child, Lydia," she said, "is of a curious temperament, withdrawn but extremely bright. Since the arrival of this doll, her behaviour has become more peculiar still. She claims it speaks to her, in Lady Vernham's voice." "And what does it say?" Holmes asked. "At first, harmless things, lullabies, phrases her mother used. I thought it grief, nothing more. But then—" She paused, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. "I heard it myself. I started, you heard it. At night. The child had fallen asleep. I was tending the fire. The room was empty save for me and the doll. And in the stillness, I heard a voice." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It said my name, clear as anything. Ellen. Then it said, 'Don't tell what you saw in the dark.' I turned. The child had not stirred. But the doll, it was upright." A silence fell, broken only by the soft hiss of Holmes's cigarette. "I should have fled the house that moment," she said, "but one does not walk away from a child." "Commendable," Holmes murmured, "though possibly hazardous." The next night, Lydia clung to me and said the doll had warned her not to speak of the man with the red hands. That was the phrase. Holmes's expression sharpened. "The red hands?" "Yes. She said she'd seen them in the garden, that they reached up through the window grate. I tried to reason with her, but then I noticed—" She stopped herself, her mouth tightening. "Yes?" Holmes prompted. "I noticed that her drawings, she draws constantly, had changed. Before she sketched birds, ponies, nursery things, but these were darker. A staircase with no end, a figure without a face, and always those red hands." She looked up, her expression drawn. "I felt watched, followed in the corridor. And the doll, it was moved from place to place, never by the child." "And what of Sir Reginald?" Holmes asked. "I told him." She gave a hollow laugh. "He said it was a case of nerves, suggested I take a tonic and a walk in the orchard. Then he locked the doll away." "Ah," Holmes said, "that was his first mistake." Miss Vervain's composure faltered slightly as she recalled the conversation. Sir Reginald was perfectly calm, too calm. He took the doll from Lydia's arms and said it was causing her distress. He placed it in a locked drawer in the parlour cabinet. But the next morning it was back, tucked beneath her arm as she slept. "And the drawer?" I asked. "Still locked. I tried it myself." Holmes turned towards the mantelpiece, where the doll now sat with unblinking eyes. "Interesting," he said softly. "You have servants at Vernham Hall. A full staff, though many have departed since Lady Vernham's disappearance. The butler remains, and the cook. But they keep their counsel. Too much, if you ask me. Have you spoken of this outside the house? Only to you?" She looked from Holmes to me. "I know it sounds irrational, but I am not mad, and that doll, that voice, knows things only Lydia's mother would have known. Things I should not know. Things I cannot forget." Holmes turned back to her, and for the first time, His gaze was not merely analytical, it was intrigued. Holmes rose and crossed the room to stand before Miss Vervain. "May I?" he asked, and without waiting for assent took her gloved hand lightly in his own. "You write with your right," he murmured, "judging by the ink stains on your third finger. Yet the left glove is slightly torn at the seam. A recent pull, I think, one caused not by work, but by conflict." She stared at him. "How?" "There is a mark," he continued, "just at the wrist, gripped tightly perhaps, by a hand larger than yours." Her colour rose. "Yes, Sir Reginald did not care for my questions." Holmes nodded. "Your coat, one button re-sewn with thread of a slightly different shade, sewn in haste. You left in a hurry." "Yes," she whispered. "As you can see," Holmes said, releasing her hand, "my colleague and I are not unfamiliar with matters that defy easy explanation, but they are always explainable, I assure you." He returned to his seat. "You are not mad, Miss Vervain, but someone would like you to think you are. And that," he added, reaching for his pipe, "is rather more interesting than it first appears." There was a pause in the conversation, filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock and Holmes's deliberate tamping of tobacco. At length he said, "I find the matter both troubling and promising." "Promising," I echoed. "From an intellectual standpoint," Holmes clarified. "A whispering doll, a locked room, a governess threatened for asking the wrong questions. Yes, Watson, I believe we should oblige Miss Vervain with our company." "You intend to visit Vernham Hall?" "I intend to examine the house, its occupants, its secrets, and, most pressingly, the doll." Miss Vervain exhaled, visibly relieved. "I must warn you," she said, "Sir Reginald is persuasive." "So are we," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "Pack lightly, Watson. I doubt Wiltshire will require more than 2 days of our time, though the whispering may yet demand a longer stay." I, for one, was not convinced. As Miss Vervain prepared to take her leave, Holmes gestured to the doll. "Leave it here, if you please." "You wish to keep it?" she asked. "Only for observation." With some hesitation, she handed it to him. The porcelain was cool, heavier than expected, and strangely lifelike. Holmes set it upon the side table once more. "No tricks?" I asked, half expecting it to speak. Holmes inclined his head and tapped the doll lightly behind the ear. "No gears, no clockwork, and yet—" He looked thoughtful. "There is always something." Miss Vervain gave a curt nod and departed, the bell jingling faintly downstairs. I looked again at the doll. It stared blankly into the room, unmoving. "Holmes," I said, "if it begins to whisper—" "You may inform me," he said dryly, "but only if it whispers something useful." And with that, he turned back to his notes, the lace-wrapped doll now a silent conspirator in our parlour. The morning we departed for Wiltshire was one of dense, rolling fog, the sort that blurs both streets and intentions. Holmes, wrapped in his long grey coat and silent as a monk, said little during the train ride, save for a brief comment on the olfactory distinction between artificial mystery and true atmospheric foreboding. I confess I found myself unusually uneasy. There was something in Miss Vervain's expression I could not shake, a fear not merely of the uncanny, but of something far more human. As our carriage passed low stone walls and the bare bones of winter trees, Holmes's eyes remained fixed ahead, indifferent to the countryside, save for a low remark. "There is more evil in well-kept estates, Watson, than in the darkest alleys of Whitechapel. One simply needs a keener lamp to find it." I nodded, though I scarcely understood then how soon his metaphor would become most uncomfortably literal. Vernham Hall presented itself like a portrait of faded dignity. Its ivy-clad stonework and tall, shuttered windows suggested both wealth and withdrawal. From the moment we entered, I felt it, something cold, Not in temperature, but in temperament. The halls were well swept, but without the bustling sense of domestic rhythm. No laughter, no scurry of feet, not even the rustle of drapery. The butler, a tall and silent man named Palmer, greeted us without curiosity and showed us into a drawing room whose fire had been lit, but too recently to feel earned. "The master will see you shortly," he said with a bow. Holmes said nothing until the man had gone. Then he looked at me and tapped his cane lightly on the hearthstone. "Observe, Watson, a house so quiet that even its silence creaks. Something here is being concealed, and not well." I shivered. Perhaps it was the wind. Or perhaps it was that, for the first time in many cases, Holmes had spoken before even examining the facts. It did not take long to notice an absence in the house, not by what was said, but by how often her name was not. Lady Vernham, wife of the baronet and mother to Lydia, was spoken of in the abstract, as though her presence were a lingering scent rather than a living figure. "She is still resting," Palmer told us. "Her health has not improved since July." "May we inquire as to the nature of her illness?" Holmes asked with studied neutrality. "Exhaustion, nervous strain, nothing contagious." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. "And the doctor?" I pressed. "Dr. Elworthy visits twice a month. His prescriptions are sufficient." Holmes raised a brow but said nothing further. Later, in a brief aside with the cook, I tried once more. "Has Lady Vernham taken any air recently?" The woman hesitated, looked over her shoulder and said simply, "I bring the tray. I leave it. Sometimes the food's been touched." That night, as I reviewed my notes, I realised something chilling. Not a single servant claimed to have seen the lady in over 3 months. The girl herself we met on the second morning, in a room near the south-facing window where she sat quietly among a paper dolls and coloured pencils. She was delicate, not in health but in manner, as if sculpted from porcelain, like the doll she still held close. Holmes, with surprising gentleness, crouched beside her. "Good morning, Miss Lydia. May I see your artwork?" She did not speak, but extended a sheet of drawing paper toward him. I leaned in. It depicted a long staircase descending into darkness. At the base, a red hand reached upward. "Very vivid," Holmes murmured. "Do you draw dreams or things you've seen?" The girl said nothing, but when I knelt beside her, she turned her large eyes on me and whispered, "She tells me when I'm in danger." "Who does?" "Mummy." She pointed to the doll. I glanced at Holmes, but he was already examining the folds of the child's dress, noting a faint trace of damp soil on the hem. "Watson," he said quietly, "I would wager that staircase is not imaginary." "You think it real?" I asked. "No," he said, standing. "I think it is remembered." That evening, once Lydia had gone to bed, Holmes requested the doll be brought to our chamber. I watched with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort as he set it upon the table and began his examination. "No gears," he muttered, "no chambers, no hidden spring. And yet—" He ran a thin blade delicately beneath the back seam, revealing a fine but deliberate fissure in the porcelain casing. "Ah," he said softly. "Come here, Watson." Inside the hollow was a velvet-lined cavity, empty now, but clearly designed to house something. "Letters, perhaps," I suggested. "Or a voice piece. Possibly, but whatever it held, it is now removed. What intrigues me is the purpose of such a feature in an otherwise unmodified child's toy." He turned the doll in the candlelight. "Notice the lips, Watson, painted with exquisite detail, but chipped ever so slightly at the corner. This doll has been handled roughly, yet only recently." "Do you suppose Miss Vervain planted the story?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No. Her fear was genuine. This doll is not haunted, but it is implicated. And whatever it once held," he paused, "I suspect it was meant to be found by a child and not by us." We made a round of quiet inquiries among the household, though to call them conversations would be generous. The The servants answered with the vague brevity of those who have much to lose and little to gain. The housemaid, a young girl with downcast eyes, said only that the child was quiet but strange, and that no one goes near the West Wing after dark. The butler, Palmer, maintained a stony silence on anything not strictly within his duties. Holmes's questions, always gently posed, were met with murmurs, glances, and polite evasions. The cook offered slightly more. Miss Vervain was a kind lady. The master didn't care for her ways. And then she added, with a hesitant glance, "Sometimes you hear things, pipes maybe, or the wind, but not like it used to be." Holmes said nothing during these interviews, but I noted how his gaze fixed not only on the speakers, but on their shoes, their hands, their direction of glance, as if they were each part of a puzzle unwilling to yield its edges. And perhaps they were. We found the gardener, an elderly man with hands like bark and eyes that seemed older still, tending to a row of dormant roses behind the stables. Holmes approached him not with questions, but with commentary on soil conditions and frost lines. This seemed to warm the man, who spoke more freely than the others. "She was a bright one, the little mistress," he muttered, trimming back a withered stem. "Still is, I reckon, though she don't speak much now. Listens too well, that one." Holmes asked what he meant. "Oh, she hears things. We all do. Whispers in the vents, footsteps in empty corridors. Some say it's the lady, sick in her chamber. I say it's the house remembering too loudly." He glanced toward the upper floors. "There's ghosts here, sir. Not the kind with sheets. The kind made of secrets." Holmes nodded. "Do ghosts repaint doors?" The man paused, squinting. "Only if they've got something to hide behind it." Holmes's eyes flicked toward the cellar entrance. "Indeed," he murmured, and I felt the air around us tighten, as if something had just shifted beneath the surface. Sir Reginald Vernham received us that evening in the library, a tall man with a voice trained in Parliament and a face practised in cordiality. "Miss Vervain has sent you, then," he said, offering Holmes a brandy. "I confess I expected as much. She has an imagination most unhelpful in a governess." Holmes accepted the drink, though he scarcely sipped. "She reports odd occurrences, unusual disturbances, concerning your daughter." Sir Reginald's smile did not falter. "Lydia has a vivid inner world, no doubt inherited from her mother. Since Lady Vernham fell ill, the child's mind has been given too much space to wander." "And Lady Vernham herself?" I asked. "She rests. I see her daily, though I doubt she remembers it." "Would she recognise your voice?" Holmes asked suddenly. The baronet blinked. "I imagine so. What a curious question." "Voices are curious things," Holmes replied. "They travel, through rooms, through pipes, even through porcelain." Sir Reginald chuckled politely, though his grip on the decanter had tightened. "I am sure Miss Vervain described more phantoms than facts," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "That is precisely what I intend to clarify." Later that night, as we made our own quiet tour of the house, Holmes halted before a cellar door near the servants' wing. "Smell that, Watson." I bent closer. "Turpentine." "Precisely. And look here. The edges of the panel." A faint sheen caught the light. "Fresh paint," I said. "Covering what?" Holmes ran a finger along the grain. "A lock, perhaps. Or a scratch. Something worth hiding." He tapped the wood lightly, listening to the hollow echo. "They repainted a door in an otherwise neglected wing of the house. That," he said with a glint in his eye, "is not the act of accident. It is the performance of concealment." He straightened. "And concealment, my dear Watson, is the cousin of confession." I followed him up the corridor, wondering just what sins might be sealed behind whitewash. It was Holmes's idea, of course, that we should wait in the child's room. "Not to protect, Watson," he had said, "but to observe." And so, Under cover of night, we found ourselves seated quietly behind the nursery screen, Holmes in studied silence, and I, for once, not altogether free of nerves. Lydia had been tucked into bed an hour earlier, her doll placed beside her as if nothing were amiss. She had uttered no complaint, nor made any mention of the voice, though she clung to the doll with white-knuckled insistence. The household slept. The fire had gone down. I checked my watch. It was nearly 1:30. Holmes had not moved. The child had not stirred, and the doll lay inert, its painted eyes gazing eternally upward. Just as I began to doubt the wisdom of our vigil, Holmes held up a single finger. Then silence, of a different sort, a pressure in the air, and then, faint as breath through gauze, a voice. It came not from the doll, but from somewhere unseen, and it spoke but one word. Lydia! It was not imagination. I am a man of medicine, not mysticism, and what we heard was no accident of wind or dream. The voice was soft, yet clear, and unmistakably that of a woman. Lydia, it repeated. Then after a pause, a fuller phrase, don't speak of the red hands. Holmes turned his head, not toward the doll, but toward the far wall. The child stirred but did not wake. The voice, gentle and urgent, came again. He watches the door, then silence. Holmes rose without sound, stepping with the precision of a surgeon toward the wall behind Lydia's bed. He tapped twice, paused, then pressed his ear against the panel. I followed. He gestured toward a discoloured patch of wallpaper near the skirting board. Here, he whispered. Do you smell it? I leaned in. Dust, aged plaster, and candle grease, he added. Someone was here, recently. His eyes glittered. It is no ghost, Watson. It is a performer, and the house, it seems, has been rigged with its own stage. I swallowed. Then the doll was never speaking? Oh, he said with a half smile, but it was always being spoken through. By dawn, Holmes had stripped back the faded wallpaper and exposed what he had suspected all along, a long, narrow pipe set into the wall, snaking behind the wooden panelling like an artery behind flesh. It was an old servant's communication shaft, the kind found in larger country houses of an earlier era. Long disused, but acoustically perfect, Holmes tested it, placing his mouth near the opening and speaking a single word, Lydia. I, on the other side of the room, heard it as clearly as if he stood beside me. Ingenious, I murmured. And sinister, he replied. This pipe runs vertically, which means it connects both floors. Someone above us has been playing ventriloquist. The mother's chamber? I asked. Unlikely, Holmes said. Recall the servants have not seen her. If she is there, she is silent. No, I believe the voice comes from a lower floor. He ran his fingers along the shaft's edge. This has been cleaned recently. See where the dust has been disturbed. And the voice itself? I asked. A mimic, he said. Not a perfect one, but close enough to deceive a child, or someone who wants to believe. As Holmes examined the wall, something on the nursery floor caught his attention, a slight unevenness in the carpet beneath Lydia's bed. He knelt, pulled back the edge, and tapped on the wooden boards. One gave a hollow note. With delicate precision, he lifted it. Beneath lay a brick panel, slightly loose at the edges. What do we have here? He murmured. The brick came free, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside, wrapped in a torn muslin cloth, was a woman's shawl, bloodied but unmistakably fine, trimmed in lace and bearing an embroidered monogram, E.V. Lady Vernham's? I whispered. Perhaps, Holmes said, his voice unusually restrained, though the initials suggest her maiden name, Evelyn Vane. That blood, I said, is not old. Nor is the cloth, he said, and someone meant it to be found eventually. He turned the shawl over carefully. Note the thread. Torn as if pulled, not cut. This was hidden in haste. He stood slowly. A message, Watson. Not one written in ink, but in silk and fear and fabric. Whoever placed it here wanted us to find it. And now, he said, looking to the door, we must discover who tried to ensure we never would. The next morning, Holmes conducted a quiet but methodical set of interviews with each remaining member of the household. Though he posed as merely curious, I could see the mechanism behind his mild questions. When was Lady Vernham last seen? Had she written, spoken, ordered a dish? Not one among them could produce a detail later than July. All but one. The butler, Palmer, claimed to have spoken with her 2 days prior. She receives her tray, he said, and I sometimes read the post aloud, as she finds writing tiresome. Holmes only nodded, but later turned to me and remarked, fascinating. The only man to have seen the lady is the one with the keys to the wine cellar and the master's ear. Curious that such devotion produces no witnesses. You think he's lying? I asked. I think, Holmes said carefully, that Lady Vernham has not merely fallen ill. I think she has been removed. Whether from her chamber or from life itself, I cannot yet say. He looked to the sealed cellar door. But wherever she is, it is somewhere the rest of this house has agreed not to look. Silence, Watson, is a wall, and this one is thick indeed. That afternoon, Holmes stood by the nursery window, watching Lydia at her drawing table. She worked quietly, her brow furrowed in a concentration far too grave for her age. The child has seen something, he said, something she cannot articulate, yet which echoes in every whispered warning, every frightened glance. And the doll? I asked. It is a channel, not for spirits, but for control. Whoever speaks through that pipe does so with purpose. The phrases are too specific, too pointed. He turned to me. Think, Watson. Don't speak of the red hands. He watches the door. Don't tell what you saw in the dark. These are not the phrases of a haunted mind. They are instructions, designed not to haunt, but to suppress. Suppress what? I asked. Memory, he said. A child sees more than we know, and understands less than we fear. But someone in this house believes Lydia knows enough to ruin them. He picked up one of her drawings and examined it, and like all crude attempts at suppression, the effort has left fingerprints. Red ones, you might say. His voice was soft, but I felt the full weight of what he was beginning to suspect. We found the cook in the scullery, her hands red with beetroot and nerves. Holmes approached gently, asking first about menus, then about deliveries. But when he turned the conversation to Lady Vernham's dietary habits, her composure began to tremble. I don't bring the trays, she said. Palmer does that. And who prepares them? I do. And do they return empty? Sometimes. Her eyes flicked toward the door, but not always. Have you ever seen the lady since midsummer? No, sir, only once. A shadow in the hall, or I thought it was. Holmes paused, then said with piercing calm, Do you know what lies behind the newly painted door in the cellar? Her eyes filled. We're not to go there. It was sealed after she went away. Who sealed it? The master, she whispered. He said it was to preserve the wine from damp, but the wine never came back out. Holmes gave a small, grim nod. You've known all along, haven't you? I've known something, she said. And then the dam broke. She began to weep, not loudly, but with a sound I shall not soon forget. It was the sound of someone who had waited too long to be believed. That evening, Holmes was unusually still. He reclined in the parlour, his eyes closed, but I knew well that he was not asleep. You're thinking, I said. Always, Watson. Of what? The velocity of silence, he replied. How fast it travels, how far it spreads. I knew better than to press. After some time, he sat up. We have a voice with no source, a woman unseen, and a child being warned not to speak. All these are symptoms. But what is the disease? Murder, I asked. Possibly, but if so, it is a clever one. Too clever to kill outright. More subtle. More operatic. He paced. Someone is orchestrating this house, conducting its silences, modulating its fear, but the tune is breaking. And the next note, I asked. Will be discord. He looked at the doll still resting on the side table. We must provoke a crescendo. How? By removing the conductor's control. He paused, then added, and giving the audience a mirror instead of music. He turned to me then with a glint I had come to recognize as the prelude to some dangerous performance. Ready yourself, Watson. Tonight, we raise the curtain. Holmes made his preparations with quiet efficiency. He summoned the local constable, a man of decent instinct and considerable moustache, and instructed him to remain hidden outside the cellar entrance. Meanwhile, Lydia's doll, freshly cleaned and emptied of any remaining contents, was returned to her room. But Holmes had added something, a small shard of polished glass fixed inside the doll's back seam. A mirror? I asked. A truth maker, he replied. It will reflect more than faces tonight. Then he handed me a children's storybook. You are to read this aloud at precisely 10 o'clock. And you? I shall be in the nursery cupboard. Not ideal, but effective. And the child? She needn't act. She need only listen. Someone will come when they believe she is alone. That night, the house held its breath. I sat beside Lydia, reading The Water Babies in a steady voice, while the doll lay beside her once more. Holmes was silent. The hallways beyond were silent. And then, just before the hour, a whisper rose from the pipe, and Lydia, clutching the doll, did not look afraid. She looked ready. The trap was set. Now we waited to see who would walk willingly into it. That afternoon, Holmes requested the doll once more. I found it unnerving how delicately he handled the object, as if it were both a fragile artifact and an accomplice to some unspoken crime. With the assistance of a small surgical blade and a curious device of his own invention, a flat brass disc containing a membrane of rubber and a pin-thin stylus, he inserted a recording needle within the hollow seam we had previously discovered. It records no more than a minute, he explained, but it shall suffice. We do not require a confession, merely a voice. With great care, he restitched the doll's seam and returned it to the child's bed, once again instructing her to behave as she always had. Lydia, with solemn nod, complied. You trust her? I asked. Implicitly, Holmes replied. She has been braver than most adults I've known. He turned to me then, the familiar gleam behind his grey eyes. And now, Watson, the theatre is set. We shall allow the villain to act. I could not help but feel that Holmes spoke not of a trap, but of an experiment, one in which the criminal had already become the most predictable variable. The nursery remained dimly lit, the air thick with the anticipation of Holmes's engineered silence. At 5 minutes past midnight, the whispering began again, precisely as Holmes had predicted. Lydia, it said, and then again, don't speak, don't tell. Holmes, crouched behind the cupboard door, tapped lightly twice on the wood. Our signal. I pressed the brass key to activate the internal mechanism hidden within the doll. Holmes had rigged it to catch vibrations through the seam, a trick he'd once used on a counterfeit spiritualist in Bloomsbury. The whisper continued. You saw too much. Don't speak of the cellar. I felt a chill pass through me. Lydia remained still in bed, her eyes closed, her arms wrapped loosely around the doll. At the exact moment the whisper ended, Holmes emerged from his place of concealment like a striking hawk. Now, Watson, he hissed. I snatched the doll from Lydia's arms and pressed the locking pin on the back of its head. Holmes was already halfway across the room, gesturing toward the hallway. He's below. He thought the house was sleeping. And now? I asked. Now, Holmes said, we wake it. And without another word, he vanished into the darkened corridor. I followed Holmes down the servants' stair, our footsteps soft, but swift against the flagstones. 2 constables, summoned earlier under Holmes's instruction, waited at the foot of the corridor by the cellar. One of them, Constable Merriweather, gave a curt nod. "He's in there, sir. We heard the floorboards shift 20 seconds ago." Holmes crouched and pressed his ear to the door. "Still speaking," he muttered. "Can you make it out?" I asked. "Something about a secret drawer and blood." He turned. His voice clipped. "Merriweather, lantern ready. When I give the word, open the door. Watson, follow me directly. And if he runs, then he betrays himself. If he fights, well, the butler's not likely to be armed with more than cowardice." With a signal from Holmes, the latch turned. The door swung inward on silent hinges, and we descended a short stone staircase. The cellar air was damp and musty, but laced with the unmistakable trace of candle smoke. And then we heard it. A voice, low and clear, whispering upward into the ceiling shaft. "Lydia, you must forget. Forget the red. Forget the night." Holmes raised a hand. "Got you," he said under his breath. "You poor, dangerous amateur." The butler, Palmer, was kneeling beside the shaft vent when we found him. He froze, one hand still cupped to the opening in the stone wall, the other holding a folded scrap of paper. In that moment, I saw not the quiet servant of Vernham Hall, but something furtive and desperate. Holmes did not hesitate. "Take the paper," he said to Merriweather. "Watson, keep him seated." Palmer made no resistance. The voice he had just whispered was now collapsed in his throat. Holmes examined the shaft. Just as I suspected, reinforced and hollow, the acoustics alone would carry a whisper 3 floors. He turned to the butler. "How long have you been doing this?" Palmer said nothing. "Where is she?" Silence. "The lady," Holmes said sharply. "Where is she?" Palmer's mouth moved, but the words were weak. "Behind the rack," he finally said. "Wine." "There is no wine," Holmes snapped. "Only secrets. Show us." But before the man could move, Holmes had already crossed the chamber and was pressing gently along the wall. "Masonry with air behind it," he muttered. "A false face, Watson, and we are about to meet what lies beneath it." And in that moment, even the shadows seemed to pause. Holmes stood before a section of the cellar wall that appeared at first glance to be a standard storage alcove lined with dusty wine bottles. But the bottles were dummies, hollowed props designed to fill the rack and discourage examination. With a sharp motion, he pressed his hand against the left panel. A faint click sounded. "Here," he said. "The grout is loose. Smell the mortar." I obeyed. "Damp, recently applied." "An amateur's effort at secrecy," Holmes muttered. He pulled back a concealed lever set behind a crate. The wall shifted inward with a reluctant groan. What lay beyond was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man. The air was close, tinged with decay and something floral, lavender perhaps, now mingled with damp. At the end of the passage sat a door, sealed with a single iron latch. Holmes opened it without ceremony. Inside, by the light of Merriweather's lantern, we saw what we had feared. A small room, stripped of furniture save for a single narrow bed and a table. And upon the bed, pale but breathing, lay a woman, Lady Vernham. Her wrists were bruised, her lips parched. But she lived. Holmes turned slowly. "We found her, Watson, but the play isn't over yet." Lady Vernham stirred faintly at the sound of Holmes's voice. Her eyes fluttered, lids heavy, as if weighted by sleep too long denied. Holmes approached slowly, his tone neither tender nor clinical, but precise. A voice meant to summon rather than comfort. "You are quite safe, madam," he said. "You have been found." She murmured something, a name perhaps, though it was lost to the damp air of the chamber. I moved to check her pulse. It was present, though sluggish. "Drugged," I said. "Likely laudanum." Administered with regularity, Holmes nodded. A convenient way to make a person forget they exist. He turned to Palmer. You fed her? As instructed, the butler muttered. Small meals. Broth. Bread. And the child? Holmes's tone chilled. You told her what? Palmer looked away. Only what I was told to say. Lady Vernham stirred again, and this time her voice was clearer. Where is Lydia? She is safe, I said quickly, and braver than any child ought to be. Her lips trembled. He said I was mad. Many men say so when truth becomes inconvenient, Holmes replied dryly. Come, Watson, she will survive, and that is more than Reginald intended. Outside, footsteps echoed. A new actor entered the scene, one who believed his crime still lay in shadow. Sir Reginald Vernham entered the cellar with theatrical urgency, a lantern raised in one hand and concern painted artfully across his face. What is the meaning of this intrusion? He demanded. Where is Palmer? What? His voice faltered as the lantern light revealed the figure on the bed. Eleanor. Holmes turned to him with the air of a man watching a stage performance he had long ago memorized. Do come in, Sir Reginald. I believe you'll find the setting familiar. What is this madness? Reginald's voice cracked. Why, that's not possible. And yet, Holmes replied, it is the most rational conclusion of all. You see, only one man had both motive and means to create a ghost within his own home. I demand you leave my house at once. Holmes signalled the constables. Your house, you say? A legal point, I admit, but tenuous, considering your wife has not signed a document in nearly 2 months. Constables, arrest him. Reginald laughed bitterly. You cannot prove I knew of this. But I can, Holmes said, producing the doll. I have your voice whispering threats through the shaft. I have a drugged wife in your own cellar, and I have a child who will never again doubt what she heard at night. Reginald said nothing as the cuffs closed. Later, as the lantern light dimmed and Reginald sat silent beneath the eyes of the law, Holmes gave me the full anatomy of the crime. It began, as these things often do, with money, he said. Sir Reginald stood to inherit nothing unless Lady Vernham was declared unfit, mentally or mortally. And so he chose the former, I asked. Holmes nodded. Indeed, he sedated her and secluded her, trusting the loyalty of his man Palmer to maintain the illusion. Then came the matter of the child. Lydia? Yes, too sharp by half. She overheard something, perhaps the moving of her mother at night, or the voice of Palmer below. Rather than risk her speaking to outsiders, Reginald chose to control her belief. With the whispering, precisely, he used the air ducts, a clever if imperfect system, to produce a nightly haunting. The doll, so beloved by the child, became the instrument of dread. Holmes smiled grimly. What better way to silence a child than through the very voice she trusts? I shuddered. And all for a signature? For the power it granted. Some men crave dominion, Watson, even if it must be stolen from a nursery and forged in a cellar. As we examined the doll one final time that night, Holmes took a penknife and sliced delicately along the lining of its skirt. From within the cotton padding, he drew forth several tiny objects, folded in silk. You see, he said, children are not the only ones who whisper through dolls. He handed me the first, a thin scrap of paper, no larger than a matchbox, upon which was scrawled in a shaky hand, I am not mad. Another read, he keeps me below. Please save the child. There were 5 in total, each written in what I now recognised as Lady Vernham's elegant but failing hand, stitched one by one into the lining where only a mother would think to leave a message for a daughter. Remarkable, I whispered. She knew the child would hold the doll close. Holmes nodded. And that eventually someone clever or desperate would think to look inside, or perhaps she hoped the child herself might find them. It is hard to say which is sadder. I turned the notes over, hands trembling. Such desperation, such clarity, Holmes said quietly. In the end, she never lost her mind, only her voice, until now. I confess that I did not sleep well that night. Even Holmes, though outwardly unfazed, lit his pipe with a certain slow deliberation that suggested the case had touched him more than most. As I watched the doll resting innocently upon the mantel, the very same doll that had whispered threats, hidden pleas, and bridged the darkness between floors, I found myself shaken, not by what had been discovered, but by how nearly it had remained undiscovered. A ghost story, I realised, is often no more than a crime draped in superstition. But what chilled me most was this. Had Lydia been less brave, or Holmes less curious, a woman might have died unmarked and a child grown into silence, haunted not by spirits, but by doubt. I remarked as much to Holmes. "Yes, Watson," he said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "The mind is easily fooled by shadows, especially when the villain understands how to cast them." He paused, then added dryly, "Still, I found dolls to be better conversationalists than half the aristocracy." And with that, he turned back to his violin. The final note of the case struck not in triumph, but in weary contemplation. We returned to Baker Street beneath a pewter sky, the streets of London slick with a thin veil of autumn drizzle. Holmes said little during the journey, content to watch the passing rooftops with unreadable expression. In my lap, the doll sat once more in its lace wrappings, a grotesque keepsake from a house too eager to forget its secrets. I confess that even in the familiar comfort of our sitting room, its presence upon the mantel gave me a faint unease. Holmes took his usual position by the fire, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes distant. "You are troubled, Watson," he murmured after some time. "Naturally," I replied. "We found a woman buried in her own home, and a child on the edge of madness. It would be unnatural not to feel disturbed." "Yet you are not disturbed by the facts," he said, "but by the fiction that nearly replaced them." I had no answer to that. The fire crackled. Outside, a cab rattled past. Then, with a slight lift of the eyebrow, Holmes leaned forward and began his explanation, with a clue so small I had dismissed it at once. "It began," said Holmes, "with Miss Vervain's description of the child's terror." He stood now, pacing slowly before the hearth. "You recall her exact words?" I frowned, trying to summon them. "She said the child had claimed the doll spoke in Lady Vernham's voice." "Precisely," said Holmes. "Not just that the doll spoke, but that it used a voice she recognised. That distinction is crucial. You see, ghosts are vague things, indistinct moanings, shadows, taps. But a child's ear is precise in ways adults often overlook. Lydia knew her mother's voice. I considered that. But couldn't it be imagination? Children's imaginations are vivid, Holmes allowed, but not always inventive. Lydia described tone, phrasing, even pauses consistent with Lady Vernham's manner of speech. A fabrication would have been more theatrical. But how could she hear it? I asked. "We found no device within the doll until you placed one there." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, but that is the beauty of misdirection. The doll never spoke. The voice came from beneath, through the venting system. So the governess was correct by accident. Miss Vervain is an honest woman," Holmes said, "but her trust in appearances nearly cost that child her sanity, and her mother her life." Holmes poured himself a measure of brandy, sipping slowly as he continued. "Once I considered the precision of the voice, another question presented itself. Who could mimic it so accurately?" I nodded. "Surely not Palmer. He is clever, but his speech is coarse." "Indeed. Yet someone coached him, or supplied the recording. Only one person in that house, aside from the child, had prolonged and private access to Lady Vernham's voice. Someone who had shared her life, studied her habits, and, most critically, stood to gain from her silencing." Sir Reginald, I said. Of course. Holmes raised his glass in a silent salute. A husband knows the timbre of his wife's scolding, her lullabies, her particular inflections, and he used them as tools of terror, not merely to frighten Lydia, but to discredit her should she speak. The child would seem hysterical, the ghostly voice, a symptom. Thus, Reginald gained control. But to what end? I asked. A signature, a diagnosis, power over the estate. To a man like Reginald, emotion is expendable, reputation is not. Holmes set his glass down. Fear, Watson, was his scalpel, and the doll his glove. It is worth noting, Holmes continued, how neatly the doll serves dual purposes, not only a distraction for investigators, but a direct instrument of fear. I looked again at the mantel. I suppose no child would question a whisper coming from her most beloved toy. Quite so, said Holmes. And once the fear had taken root, it needed little tending. Lydia ceased to trust her own senses. Each night reinforced the illusion. She became complicit in her own terror. Diabolical, I muttered, and so very calculated. By using superstition, Reginald bypassed rational inquiry. Even the servants, I suspect, chalked the girl's fear up to childish nerves. Holmes drew a sheet of paper toward him and began scribbling something absently. Superstition, he said, is the cheapest accomplice a criminal can employ. It does not demand a wage, merely a suggestion. But why not simply frighten the child with a masked man or a threat? Because that would make her speak. Reginald wanted silence, and the fear of a ghost is a private one. Hard to explain and easy to dismiss. No bruises, no evidence, only shivers in the dark. He looked up. There is cruelty in such elegance, Watson, the kind that wears a monocle and sups at gentlemen's clubs. Holmes reached for his pipe now, tamping the bowl with careful deliberation. There were, of course, several secondary clues. The fresh paint on the cellar door, for instance. I remember it well, I said. Thick, uneven, and applied recently. Exactly. It concealed the scratch marks and signs of movement, not from a prisoner necessarily, but of something being shifted regularly. Bedsheets, trays, perhaps even the woman herself. And the servants? Their stories did not align, Holmes said. Palmer claimed Lady Vernham was resting upstairs, but the maid spoke of clothes untouched in weeks. The cook swore she heard footsteps at night, yet Lady Vernham was supposedly bedridden. When timelines fail to intersect, Watson, one must examine who controls the clock. Sir Reginald. He dictated every account, and no one dared contradict him. Holmes lit his pipe. And then there was the nature of her illness, described vaguely as melancholia. But no physician had been summoned, no prescription acquired. In fact, all documentation of her decline was verbal and second-hand. I rubbed my forehead. So he isolated her, then rewrote her story. Precisely, said Holmes. He buried her not in earth, but in narrative. And until we arrived, the tale was holding fast. The fire crackled softly. Holmes leaned back, exhaling smoke in slow contemplation. Truth, Watson, is a poor liar. Holmes reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded envelope, now softened at the corners by repeated handling. You recall these, Watson? He asked, spreading out several childlike crayon drawings upon the table. Lydia's sketches, I said, recognizing the erratic scrawls and blobs of colour. She drew them during our first visit. Indeed, Holmes replied. Observe this one. He pointed to a large rectangular shape, bordered by black and shaded heavily in brown. She called this the room with the whisper. Notice the lack of windows and the single crooked door drawn at the base. The cellar, I breathed. Exactly. And here, he indicated another picture, with a looping blue line snaking from one corner to the centre. She marks the sound's path. The airshaft, Watson. She had mapped it instinctively. I stared at the page with fresh respect. She knew the truth, I murmured. but she lacked the words to speak it. Holmes nodded. When the intellect is too young for articulation, the subconscious must draw instead of describe. He tapped the crayon lines with a finger. We often overlook the silent witnesses, and yet, here were Lydia's depositions, colourful, unfiltered, and devastatingly accurate. He looked up. Her drawings led me beneath the floorboards before even Reginald realised he had begun to lose. Holmes stood, turning once again to face the mantel where the doll still sat, absurdly delicate, its button eyes as expressionless as ever. There was, however, one detail that confirmed my suspicions beyond doubt, he said. It was not in the documents, nor the paint, nor even the child's sketches. It was a phrase. A phrase? I repeated. Yes, said Holmes. Spoken in the doll's whisper. It was Lydia's frightened mimicry that first repeated it, as quiet as a curled fern. The words struck something faintly familiar within me, though I could not place it. That expression is not common, Holmes continued. In fact, I have heard it only once before. 3 years ago, at a musical salon on Wimpole Street, I was introduced to a certain Lady Vernham. She spoke little, but when I commented on her patience with a rather erratic violinist, she replied, I was trained to sit as quiet as a curled fern. You remembered that? I asked in astonishment. It was her tone, more than her words, Holmes admitted. There was a kind of gentle steel in it, the sort of softness that does not bend to chaos, but absorbs it. He gave a rare smile. That phrase, emerging from the doll's lips, made one thing clear. The voice had once belonged to the living. He paused. And the living, I suspected, had not yet died. There was a rare pause then, and Holmes seated himself once more in the armchair, fingers tapping the rim of his teacup in a manner almost contemplative. You know, Watson, he said slowly, we often speak of deduction as though it were a blade. Cold, unerring, decisive. And is it not? I asked. He looked into the fire. In most matters, yes, but this case, oddly enough, required a softness I usually discard. You mean Lydia, I said. I mean the human mind, particularly the unguarded corners where instinct resides. He turned his gaze to me. It was not deduction that told me to listen to a child's drawings or to recall a lady's phrasing from a half-forgotten salon. It was something else. Memory, pattern, intuition, and above all the certainty that a child's terror is often more truthful than an adult's denial. You surprised me, Holmes, I said. You were gentler than I expected. A doll, he replied dryly, makes a better confidant than many adults. It neither lies nor interrupts. Then, with that familiar spark returning to his features, he added, but I much prefer a loyal biographer who refills the brandy without needing to be asked. I obliged him, smiling despite myself. As I sat across from him that evening, brandy in hand, I found myself watching Holmes not with the usual mixture of amusement and exasperation, but with something nearer to reverence. You took whispers, Holmes, I said at length, and made them into confessions. You saw what none of us dared consider. Nonsense, he said, waving a hand. I simply observed what was present and discarded what was sentimental. And yet, I said, you gave dignity back to a silenced woman and restored clarity to a terrified child. That is more than observation, Holmes. That is grace. He scoffed, but gently. I merely lifted the veil. The rest was waiting beneath. We were silent for a time. Outside, London murmured its usual midnight chorus. Inside, the doll remained on the mantel, still and mute, yet no longer terrifying. There are crimes, I said softly, that wear the clothes of the supernatural, but when stripped bare, reveal only man's cruelty and cowardice. Holmes nodded once. And it is precisely because they pretend to be ghosts, he said, that they so often go unpunished. I looked at him, at the man who could hear truth in silence and see maps in a child's drawing. I have rarely admired him more. The fog had lifted by the time we returned to Baker Street. though the streets still bore the hush of a city caught between lamplight and dreams. Holmes said little on the journey. Once within our lodgings, he placed the lace-wrapped doll upon the mantel, where it sat in eerie repose, its silence now a benediction, not a threat. Mrs. Hudson had left a kettle near the hearth, and as I poured out the tea, Holmes stretched his legs before the fire and drew his dressing gown tighter around him. "A strange case," I murmured. "Not our usual fare." Holmes gave a faint nod. "No, but instructive." We sipped in silence. The doll stared blankly into the room, and I could not help but wonder how many stories it would carry, now that the whispers had ceased. Holmes stirred his tea once, twice, and set the spoon down with a delicate clink. "It is remarkable, Watson," he said, "how readily the mind constructs ghosts where only drafts exist." "You believe Lydia imagined it all?" I asked. "Not imagined, received," he corrected. "But her interpretation was guided by fear. The child was told the world contained hauntings, so she found them." He glanced toward the mantel. "A sound in the wall becomes a spirit's murmur. A breath from a shaft becomes a curse. Fear does not wait for proof. It simply occupies." "So the doll was never alive," I said. "Only believed to be." "Which, to the mind of a child," said Holmes, "is quite enough." He reclined further, steepling his fingers. "Most ghost stories, Watson, are born not from spirits, but suggestion." Holmes's gaze had drifted toward the doll again, but I knew his thoughts were elsewhere. "You see, Watson," he said, "true malice rarely wears the grotesque face. It often smiles, dresses well, and speaks softly." "Like Lady Vernham," I ventured. "Precisely. Evil does not parade, it conceals, and nothing conceals better than the innocent." He tapped the side of his teacup. "Even a child's toy, that most harmless of symbols, can serve as a mask." I felt a chill, not from weather, but from implication. "One forgets," I said, "that horror need not be loud to be lethal, nor need it be ugly," Holmes added. "That is its cleverest disguise." And with that, he closed his eyes, though I doubted he slept. The fire had burned low, casting soft halos against the bookshelves. I found my thoughts lingering on Lydia. "She trusted those around her," I said quietly. "And they used that trust to silence her." Holmes did not answer. "There's cruelty in confusing a child's terror for mischief," I continued. "It robs them of the words they need." Still no reply. I turned and saw his eyes half-lidded, watching the flames. "It is not the supernatural that haunts me tonight," I said, "but the very real ways adults betray those they should shield." Holmes stirred then, just slightly. "That," he said, "is why I pursue men, not phantoms." I nodded. "And why some ghosts, it seems, are better left behind, or unimagined entirely." Holmes stretched languidly and regarded the doll with mock solemnity. "For all its previous outbursts," he said, "this one at least holds its tongue now." I chuckled. "You prefer porcelain to people?" "In certain social circles," he replied. "The conversational range of a well-glazed figurine is vastly preferable to that of an aristocrat with secrets." He smirked. "Porcelain companions, Watson, are quieter, more decorous, and far less inclined toward exaggeration." "But not as useful in a pinch," I said. "True," he conceded. "Still, I dare say this one has earned its keep." And with that, he turned once more to the fire, his face unreadable. The mantel clock struck 11 with a measured dignity, and just as the final chime faded, Mrs. Hudson entered with a single envelope. "Delivered by hand, sir," she said. Holmes took it wordlessly. The paper bore a Swiss postmark, and the seal was unfamiliar. He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the contents. Then, a pause, a faint smile. He folded the letter and placed it in the pocket of his dressing gown. "Nothing pressing?" I asked. "On the contrary," said Holmes, his voice smooth as ever. "Something rather alpine." He said no more, but the initials on the envelope, IA, said quite enough. As we sat once more in our Baker Street lodgings, the doll now resting peacefully on the mantel, Holmes leaned back with his fingertips pressed together, his gaze half lost in the dancing firelight. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured, "how the sharpest cruelty often chooses the gentlest disguise. In this case, the instrument of manipulation was not a knife or a pistol, but lace, lullabies, and whispered lies." He gave a soft exhale, almost a sigh. The mind of a child, untouched by cynicism, is a most fertile ground, but also the most defenseless. I nodded, unable to shake the image of Lydia's wide, searching eyes. Holmes added with a flicker of wry humour, "It is a peculiar world, my dear Watson, where the porcelain keeps more secrets than the people who gave it to the child. What do you think was the criminal's gravest mistake? Underestimating a child's memory, or overestimating their own ability to erase it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And if this tale intrigued you, do share it with someone who appreciates a story where even silence can speak volumes.